such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is one that was solved after 57 years. This is Irene Garza's strange murder. Now, it took nearly 6 decades to convict a killer, but everyone had known from day one and done nothing about it. This case involves a huge cover-up, injustice, and a survivor who tried her hardest to bring Irene Garza's family the answers they deserved. I also want to thank today's partner for allowing me to continue making these videos. Now, I am partnering with Yours app, which is actually a self-care app that I have been in desperate need of lately. And if you have too, then listen up, because this is one of the best. Yours app not only has mood check-ins, psychology, and advice, but it also contains meditations, music, breathing clocks, and my favorite, which is actually the sleep section, where it has anything from ASMR to storytelling to different sounds, and you can start off your night relaxed. I know personally that it's very hard to put yourself first sometimes, and this app allows you to do that, and you can constantly have it with you. And so I think that's one of the best things. It's like self-care on the go, or wherever you are at, you can make time for it. And I've even been putting on their sounds of nature while I work, which has actually kept me productive. Yours app is adding new content every single week, and it is my go-to when I'm not feeling well mentally. And so if you want to check it out, maybe it will be your go-to as well. You can try it for free, but if you would like a premium membership, Yours app is giving that yearly membership for 60% off, which is insane to me. Such a crazy deal. 60% off the yearly membership using the code Brooke or going to yoursapp.com/Brooke. I also want to say it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leave me a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1960 in Texas, and Irene Garza lived in McAllen with her family. She was actually a 25-year-old school teacher who taught 2nd grade, and she had been born to Nicholas and Josephine, who owned their own little dry cleaning business. Now, during her teenage years, she actually played drums as the first Latina majorette at her school and was also a beauty queen. Now, she was named Miss All South Texas Sweetheart, became homecoming queen as well, and was the first from her family to graduate from college. She had been privileged enough for all of this to happen due to the success of her parents' dry cleaning business, so that they could basically move on the other side of the tracks. They had a little bit more money, and they were able to fund all of the things that Irene wanted. But money didn't change sweet Irene. She had plenty of her own struggles, including that of being a Latina woman in a school that was very affluent and majority was white. And so she kind of felt a lack of sense of a community. And although that didn't stop her, she did, of course, notice this, and it was often something that weighed on her. Irene was more of a shy girl. She kept to herself, and so that also didn't help with, feeling like not having a community was a big portion of her life. And so she was able to find a little bit of peace at her church, which was actually Sacred Heart Church, where she was able to join others in her Catholic faith. For much of her life, she felt comfort in attending the Mass and the communion. And as she got older, her confidence got better due to her passion at her job. She was able to teach the disadvantaged children who were actually from, the other side of the tracks where she had come from before, more low-income families, and she took her job very, very seriously. She was actually the secretary of the Parent-Teacher Association, and she was often going in early and staying late just to help the students in any way that they needed. And although her salary wasn't much, her being able to save money by living with her parents wasn't just just to, move out. She wasn't saving up for a home. She actually would spend that money on books, supplies, clothing, anything that her students needed. What she had no idea of, though, is how beautiful she truly was on the inside and the outside. Irene was a very beautiful woman, and everywhere she went, she was noticed, especially by men. Although even with all this male attention, Irene wasn't very interested. She actually had her own plans. She wanted to stick with her career, knowing that eventually she did want a family. She did want children. But she was very close with her own. At this time, she was, sharing a living space in a car with them. And that's how she enjoyed it. She was happy with what she was doing and where she was in life. And she wasn't looking to change that. Irene was finally becoming the woman that she dreamed of. And she had worked hard to become her. Yet, this would all be stripped away. You see, on April 16th, the Saturday before Easter Sunday, this was one of Irene's favorite times. She would, make Easter baskets for the little kids. She would put up decorations, and she was at church for most of this weekend as a devoted Catholic. And so she was asking her parents if she could actually go to the church that Sunday night with their car, which is why she had to ask. And she would be leaving at around 6:30 and would drive the 12 blocks to get there. They were, of course, so excited for her to be going to church. They were saying, of course you can go, you're 25 years old. However, she had left, and the later that it became, the more worried that they became, but they weren't necessarily panicking because there was that midnight mass that they believed she possibly could have stayed for because she had just gone for a confession. However, it got to 3 a.m. and the car still wasn't in the driveway, and they knew that there was no reason why she should still be at the church at 3 a.m. And so that is when they immediately drove to the McAllen Police Department to report their daughter missing, and they claimed that Irene just wanted to go to church for this confession, could have stayed longer. However, they knew that she never stayed out this late. When they went to talk to the priest that she could have spoken to during confession, they asked, did you say anything that could upset her or disturb her and make her want to run away or, have some time to herself? And he said no. And if you don't know, confession is where Irene and many others could go to admit their sins within these walls to the priest after baptism. So basically, this church member would be asking the priest to be pardoned by God for their sins, and then the priest is actually forbidden to repeat that confession to anybody else. Now, this could be from lying, cheating, violence, sex, abortion, homosexual behavior, porn use, and it's all very looked down upon by the Catholic Church, which is why they feel as though this is a sin and they need to confess. It's unknown what Irene needed to confess that day. She wasn't telling anybody this, and they didn't know if she actually even went to confession or not, especially as it appeared as though she wasn't one to break the rules for any reason. She would really stick to her faith and what they believed was a sin. But when investigators arrived at the church, Irene was nowhere to be found. However, the family car was still in the parking lot. The search began, and 2 days later, there was a heel that was found near the curb that was near the church. This was a beige high heel shoe that Irene was known to wear, and her parents knew she had worn it that day. The heel was also missing from it as though it had broken off. But as her parents confirmed that these were the shoes that she wore that night, these were Irene's shoes, her students were missing their teacher. And of course they had a substitute teacher, but no one could substitute for Miss Garza because she was one of the best teachers in the world and her students loved her. That same day, while still searching in town about 300 yards away from where the shoe was found, more evidence was located. It appeared to be an actual trail of several hundred yards of evidence just strewn about. A man named Alfredo Barrera, who was actually a teacher who worked with Irene and was out helping look, had found a black patent leather purse lying in the middle of the field, and Irene's ID was still inside. Moving down the road, they found the matching shoe to the beige high heel, as well as a lace veil that is often worn at confession. Once again, everything was confirmed to be Irene's. Witnesses at the Sacred Heart Church were then spoken to, especially those who were there that night who could give insight on if Irene was even at confession. And one claimed that she actually signed the cross as she entered the church, and another said that they had seen her kneeling by herself in a pew. But the next witness was the most important because they had claimed that they had seen Irene get into the line. She was asking if she could actually get in front of them because she was running late and wanted to get through the line quicker. This seemed to confirm that Irene in fact did go to confession that night. However, then another witness said, yes, she was in line, but then she actually had a veil over her face and she stepped out of line, and they didn't know where she had gone from there. They didn't know whether she had left the building, no one had seen her leave, or if she had gone to a different location in the church. They just knew she stepped out of line. Not one person saw her enter the confession room, and no one saw her leave the church. No one could say where she had gone. While the largest search in this area was being put together, the parents were trying to figure out why this could have happened, why Irene could have disappeared. And as the news of her disappearance spread, her longtime friend came forward saying that Irene had actually written her a letter. She had gotten this letter 7 days prior to Irene's disappearance, and the 5 pages Irene had written was a response to the surprise letter that her friend had sent her. She had written, "You know what a welcome surprise it was to hear from you? I've made quite a few friends this year and I'm much happier than I've ever been. I've been dating 2 men, one I won't mention his name, but we double dated the last time you were here. The other was an Anglo boy, not really handsome, but cute and religious, which is important. My ex sent me several cards and a box of candy on Valentine's Day. I can't lie, I think of him often and wonder if I'll ever get over him, between you, me, and the 4 walls. I pray constantly that if it be God's will, I will get over him eventually." However, it was the last part that intrigued investigators the most, because Irene was going on about how she had overcome her terrible shyness and that teaching was such a joy and that she was becoming so sure of herself. But then at the end, she said, "Remember the last time we talked, I told you I was afraid of death? Well, I think I'm cured. You see, I've been going to communion and mass daily, and you can't imagine the courage and faith and happiness it has given me." Her family hoped that this wasn't a premonition of what they would find. Investigators were going on horseback all around the church and all around the town as well, and they went from house to house all around that area asking if anybody had seen her that night or what had happened to her. And although all of the residents wanted to help, nobody had any information. Then the phone rang at the Garza's residence, and they quickly picked up the phone and they heard that Irene had been kidnapped and was staying at the hotel in Hidalgo, which was only 16 minutes from McAllen. Investigators rushed to this hotel to save her, and unfortunately this was just a prank call, and somebody had pretended to be Irene Garza to her own parents. This was devastating to Nicholas and Josefina. They had no idea how to help. They didn't know why this would happen. They knew Irene wasn't one to run away for any reason, and so they were at a loss waiting for investigators to do their job. And investigators had gotten a call from a waitress who was in Edinburgh, which was 19 miles away from McAllen, and she had said that a customer had been there and said that he had killed Irene and that she was next. When they tracked this man down, he said, "Oh, it was just a joke. I had been drinking so much tequila that day." They found nothing that would connect him to Irene or the church, so they let him go. 5 days of searching later, they were dragging the canals. The Border Patrol planes were flying overhead, but it would be the public that would actually find Irene. Investigators got a call that Thursday at around 7:40 a.m., and Miss Garza's students had been without their teacher for almost a week at this point. As officers and divers arrived, Irene was lifted out of the 2nd Street Canal. This was only a few miles away from where the trail of evidence down that road was located, and it appeared as though it had been thrown from a moving car. She was fully dressed except for her shoes and her underwear, and she had a lavender blouse that was unbuttoned and a petticoat that was ballooned over her head from the water. The public had gathered around at this point, and they had seen that Irene had 2 black eyes and her entire right side of her face was bruised. Irene was sent in for an autopsy as investigators went full force into questioning everyone they could, not only in McAllen but also in Hidalgo and Edinburgh, where they had gotten the tips from as well. All sex offenders were located to be marked off the list one by one, and co-workers from Irene's school were also questioned as well, as they would have been the closest next to the people at the church to know her. They also went to talk to her ex-boyfriends, her current entanglement entanglements, and a $2,500 reward was also posted. However, the main suspect was the man that Irene was said to go and see that night. Or so she said. Since no one had officially seen Irene go into the confession, they couldn't prove that this was true, but the Sacred Heart's priest was going to be looked into deeply. He was their prime suspect at this time. He was a 27-year-old named John Fite, or Father John Fite. He had been originally questioned when she first went missing, and he had said that she had gone to confession, but she had told him her confession in the church rectory, which was actually a housing unit for the priest that was nearby the church. He said she had actually come to him in the rectory and asked him for a question of confidence, and he sent her back to the church and said, "We can talk there." He then denied killing her, and he was the one that Irene's parents had spoken to and asked, "Did you say anything that could upset her?" And he had said no. He said that after talking to them, he was worried that he did say something that upset her and that it led to this, but he didn't hurt her. The autopsy results then came back, and it was revealed that Irene had died of suffocation. If that wasn't bad enough, she had also been beaten by a hard object and had then been sexually assaulted while unconscious. Examiners searched for any blood, hair, semen, but they knew it was likely they were not going to find anything because it would have been washed away in that canal. It was found, though, that the amount of decomposition that she had already gone through meant she had been in that canal for around 4 days, but it had been 5 days since she vanished. So it was believed that the day that was accounted for between the time of the murder and the disposal was when she was kept and possibly tortured. Irene's brother-in-law was the one who agreed to identify her in the morgue, and even to him, it was so horrific that as soon as he saw her, he ran out of the room. Then a sheriff's deputy who was searching the banks around that 2nd Street canal where Irene had been pulled out of had seen a muddy shoe print. Now, this was extremely lucky because it was raining, and so all of the mud, all of the possible evidence was quickly washing away. But it could have been from anyone who walked that path, so they weren't sure, except for the fact that there was a strand of hair within it. And when they took that hair, it was identified to be Irene's. As investigators looked closer to that area, they did find some tire tracks, and then right there was like the imprint of the petticoat that Irene had been wearing as though she had been drugged through that area. Unfortunately, the tire tracks and the shoe print wouldn't give them much more because they were barely there anyway and slowly being washed away, but they were able to see that the size of the shoes were men's shoes anywhere from size 8 to 11, which is quite a range. While investigators demanded polygraphs from at least 60 different possible suspects, the community was completely on edge. Newspapers were printing theories and rumors to be facts, and no one knew what was really going on. There was one story that said that a man who had died of a heart attack just a few days after Irene disappeared was involved with her disappearance, and that is what caused his heart attack, but they had no proof of this at all. His name was Leo El Leon, and his name was being put through the ringer, although his family was still grieving. Some others believed that it was just somebody who was driving through town, and so they were already gone by this point and they would not be captured. It was known that Irene was one of the most beautiful women in town, and that men were often hitting on her. They were looking at her, they were asking her out, and she was often turning them down because she did not want a relationship at that moment. And so it wasn't hard to theorize that she had turned someone down and they had killed her because of it. Now, although this was very possible, that meant that it could have been anybody in the church or outside of the church that night. Well, the mayor, Philip Boyai, decided that he was going to do whatever it took to find the answers, and he allowed the city's commissioners to write the police department a blank check to use whatever money necessary to find a killer. The community had also raised $10,000 more to add to her reward fund, and most of the town believed in one story that had happened that night. Those who had been at the church said that the confession line moved extremely slowly that night. It wasn't usual. I mean, it took some time, but it was never as slow as it was that very night. Church members had told investigators that John Fite, who was supposed to be the priest listening to the confessions, was away several times while the confessions were supposed to be happening. But it was what the fellow priests had commented to investigators that made them on edge. And that was the fact that, at midnight mass after the confessions, John had had scratches on his hands. They also claimed it wasn't normal for a priest to talk to anyone in their own church rectory, especially about a confession. When investigators questioned John Fight again, they had gotten to the point where they said, look, we know that you had scratches on your hands. What was that about? And he said that he actually would fiddle with his glasses a lot when listening to these confessions, and they broke. So he then needed to go back to the rectory, to his home, and that is when he realized that he forgot his keys. So he ended up having to climb to the second floor, and that is where he scraped his hands, on the outside of the home to get inside. And that's when he said Irene came to him, except this time he said that he hadn't sent Irene to the church right after she had been talking to him. He had heard her confession because she had a fear of being overheard and didn't want to be around anybody. But John was given polygraph tests, and he passed them all, and so they were no closer to getting any answers. The church was extremely distraught that one of their priests were taken in for a polygraph in the first place, but that didn't mean investigators were going to stop looking into the church. Everyone who was there in line for the confession that night was asked for their mental images in grave detail about who exactly was in line. Investigators were able to map out the entire church where everyone was standing, but this didn't do anything to help. This case slowly went cold, but anyone in McAllen would point the finger at John Fight. He had just come to their town, he had just been through seminary training, and he was in McAllen for a year for pastoral training. And he had been born the youngest of 3 in Chicago and was raised in a German Catholic household. But when he was 13, he was sent to an all-boys boarding school, and there he went on to an all-boys college, and he became a priest with a vow of celibacy. Everyone claimed that John was very smart, well-mannered, but he was more of a loner. And those who spoke about him at church said that they didn't believe he really had a passion for priesthood, and that when they talked to most priests, they would, talk about their religion and how they felt, but when they asked him, he just said it was something that he did. It was then found that 3 weeks prior to Irene's attack, there was another one. Now, this was 12 miles away from the church at yet another Sacred Heart church. It was on March 23rd of 1960 in Edinburgh, and 20-year-old Maria American Guerrera had been attacked. She had been a college student who was visiting this church because she was going to the altar to pray. She was suddenly grabbed from behind with a rag over her face, and she fell backwards and began to bite her attacker's fingers until she tasted blood. She was sexually assaulted at this point, and she was fighting back, and she was thrown into a wall where she actually got away and ran out to yell for help. Thankfully, the attacker didn't come after her. He disappeared, and she was able to get out and survive this horrible ordeal. Now, she, of course, had not gotten her justice for her case. They weren't sure who had done this to her, but when she heard of Irene's murder, when she heard of her disappearance, she came forward to investigators saying that when she was at her church that night, she had seen a young man with dark hair and horn-rimmed glasses who was sitting in one of the back pews. She noticed him when she walked in, right before her attack, and she wouldn't have thought much of him except for she believed he might have been the person who was actually watching her earlier that day. She had seen this man in this blue and white sedan and believed that he was watching her, and then he was there at the church she was going to. So she was a little eerie, but she said that since she was, in church with God, she didn't want to be focused on that fear because she was going to go pray. Unfortunately, her gut feeling about this man turned out to be correct, or so she thought. She didn't actually see the face of her attacker. Now, John Fight was also questioned when it came to this attack, and he admitted being at that church 12 miles away to see a priest, but denied attacking. But 2 years after Maria's attack and Irene's murder, John Fight was charged with Maria's sexual assault. When they went to arrest him, it appeared as though he had left the state, and so they had to track him down. He claimed he actually left and checked him into a psych ward because he was having a nervous breakdown. Now, this went to trial, and it ended up being a hung jury, but then John pled no contest and was found guilty of a misdemeanor charge of aggravated assault instead. But he was not sent to jail or to prison. He was sent to a Catholic monastery, but he didn't feel comfortable with the lifestyle there, so he was actually sent to a treatment center for troubled priests. Now, this was in New Mexico, and when he finished his own treatment, he then became a supervisor there. But in Irene's case, no one had been charged. As the years went by, witnesses began to die, investigators were retiring, newbies were on the force, members of the church had changed, and the entire community slowly put Irene in the back of their minds, even though that's not what they wanted to do. But it had been so many years. They had no idea at the time of all the secrets that had been hidden from them. You see, the head priest of the church that night was Father Joseph O'Brien, who ended up going on a TV show 40 years after the murder, saying that he didn't know anything about her death. He had told Irene's parents at the church that if John did do this, he would be punished by the church, and that it would be worse than a sentence handed down by the courts. They believed him, feeling like they shouldn't question a priest, and so they both were in their 90s when they finally passed away and did not see their daughter get justice. 54 years later, 5 entire decades, it was 2014 when District Court Judge Ricardo Rodriguez began to look into Irene's case once again, and he was determined to do it differently. You see, it turned out that 12 years prior to this, a confession had actually been made. It was 2002 when a man named Dale Tackney came forward. He was a monk who had worked as a mentor at the monastery that John had gone to for Maria's assault. And he said that he had been John's counsel and was trying to see if he would be a good fit to be a monk as well. And that is when Dale admitted that John had confessed to him that he had not only assaulted a girl, but he had also killed another.
He put her in a bathtub and also covered her with a plastic covering. When he left this place, things he heard last was, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe."
Dale said it was not his time to judge John for this, and so he never came forward. But after all the years of this eating at him, he could no longer keep this secret. And so he believed this crime had happened in San Antonio. He called investigators there. And after a while of trying to figure out, who this could be, who even the victims were, because they didn't even know that, it eventually traveled to McAllen's investigators, and Irene's murder investigation was reopened. That is when they decided to go back to Father Joseph O'Brien and say, "Do you know more than you let on for all of these years?" And he finally admitted that John had confessed to him shortly after the murder.
Father O'Brien, did anybody tell you Fight committed the murder?
He told me.
This information came from John Fight himself. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Had tricked John Fight into telling me that he had killed Irene Garza. I said, "How can I help you if I don't know what happened?" And then he said he bound her and gagged her, and she died of asphyxiation.
When news of this reopening spread, all hell broke loose. Witnesses were coming forward. One was saying that he had actually done the polygraph test on John all those years ago, and he had read that investigators had reported that he had passed those polygraph tests. However, they later edited it to say that it was inconclusive. But this examiner for the polygraph said that John had actually failed. Now, 2 years later, when all this was happening, the DA did bring this to the grand jury after having to be begged to basically do it, but Dale, Father Joseph, nor John were given subpoenas saying that they had to be involved. So they weren't there. The grand jury didn't vote to arrest John, and the DA said that he was actually relieved about this because he claimed that Father Joseph was just suffering from dementia, didn't know what he was saying, and Dale had been fed the information about the murders to blame John and to falsify a confession. The DA then said to Irene's family, "Why would anyone be haunted by her death? She died. The killer got away." Now, this is DA Rene Guerrera, not Ricardo Rodriguez, who would be helping them in the future. Because at this point, the district court judge Ricardo Rodriguez was taking a completely new look at the case without the DA completely, and Father Joseph O'Brien had already passed away. This made it even harder and John Fite was also living his life as a free man in Arizona. He had left the priesthood 10 years after Irene's murder, and he had worked at that treatment center as a supervisor for priests. And there, he worked with a man named James Porter, who was a priest who was believed by the community to be sexually assaulting children. He was sent there for treatment, and John Fite ended up clearing him completely, and he was able to go work as a priest once again. However, he ended up abusing more than 100 children before eventually, of course, being defrocked. John was then later quoted saying that if someone is doing something wrong, they are not above the law simply because they are an ordained minister. John had then moved to Arizona. He got married. He had 3 children. He then began to work at a food charity, and no one had any clue what he had done prior. He was now in his 80s. He lived a full life, unlike Irene. Ricardo was determined to get him sentenced and justice served, and 2 years later, he would do just that. It was February of 2006 when John was arrested at his home and extradited back to Texas. It turned out that the survivor of John Fite, Maria, had known that it was a priest that very day when she had gone to investigators the same day it happened. She saw him wearing black pants, the man she saw in the pew, and this was what priests often wore, and she knew that, and it wasn't a very common pant then. And she told this theory to as many people who would listen, but nobody listened to her. The theory had actually quickly been quieted by the church, who believed that these priests were men of God and absent of moral failings. When Irene ended up murdered, Maria voiced her opinion once again, even though she knew she would be met with backlash and silence. Investigators were said not to listen to her, and those who even wanted to believe her said that they couldn't. Another thing she came out with was the fact that the man she had seen stalking her was in a blue and white sedan, and John Fite drove a 1956 Ford sedan that was blue and white at that time. When questioned about Maria's case, the first time, before, he was finally caught for it 2 years later, John had a cut on his finger, the same place that Maria had bit her attacker. And he said that he was actually just going to fix the mimeograph machine of the bell, and that's how it happened. However, even then, the fellow priest had said that he didn't make it in time to do anything with the bell, and Maria had also picked John out of a lineup. But nothing was done until 2 years later. One of Irene's friends even said that after Irene was murdered, she wanted to remain Catholic, and to do so, she knew better than to discuss what she believed was the truth. She had gone to Sunday Mass at that church after Irene's funeral, where members of the church were actually warned not to bear false witness to any member of the church. The exact words were allegedly, the priest at Our Lady of Sorrows said he knew that rumors were going around about a priest being involved in Irene's murder. It is impossible that a priest would commit a crime like this. Don't speak of it. Don't even let yourselves think it. A letter was then found that was believed to change everything. It had been written in 1960 by Father J.F. Palicki, who was also a Catholic priest. Now, it was dated 4 months after Irene's murder. He spoke of talking to the sheriff on the case, who was also Catholic. And Father said that the sheriff believed that the case was too weak for prosecution if it went that far. He also said the prosecution needed to be shown how weak it was so it wouldn't bring it out in public print. He also spoke on this having political implications for John Kennedy, who was running for president and was also Catholic. It was then discussed that there would be no hiring of a lawyer, and a detective was not to be put on the case because they didn't want to stir anything up. He did, though, want to hire a first-class private detective to sit down with Father Nash, who I assume was the head priest at the Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh, which was 12 miles away. And they also wanted to talk to Father Joseph O'Brien, who was the head church at the Sacred Heart Church Irene had last been seen at. They discussed that this detective would then write up the case and highlight the loopholes before showing the police chief how wrong they were to go forward with this prosecution. The letter then goes on saying that they should wait about 3 or 4 months to wait till everything dies down, and then have this young man, is how they described him, transferred to another part of the country as normal obedience. After that, he would be sent to a foreign mission. But in the exact words, the reason for the first move is to get him out of the area of suspicion. If something happens, the officers of the area will always be suspicious of him. Father then began talking about how the sheriff had told him the longer the time, the weaker the case. He said, "Your worries are ours, since we fight the same evil one who has concocted this thing in his ceaseless fight against the church, and to stop the good being done by your wonderful congregation. My prayers and my mass intentions are with you, Father, and I am sure our priest will pray hard for a special intention mentioned as such to them." Now, although nobody was named, the only suspect investigators had even come close to arresting was John Fite. It was then uncovered that when Irene's body was found, they drained that entire canal to look for more evidence. And at the bottom, that is when they would find a light green Eastman Coda slide viewer with a long black cord, which is basically a photographic slide viewer. And investigators asked the public who they believed it belonged to. And John Fite had come forward. He said he bought it the last summer at a drugstore. After all this evidence that appeared to be covered up was uncovered, John Fite was headed to trial after 57 years. He pled not guilty, and his defense wanted a $100,000 bond due to the fact that he had stage 3 kidney and bladder cancer. The prosecution, though, was asking for a $750,000 bond, and the judge said, okay, we'll set it at $1 million. He was 85 years old. He needed a walker to get around, and the prosecution said that many suspected John, but didn't want to harm the church's reputation. This was presented with a 700-page document of all of the evidence of this being such a huge cover-up. Dale Tackney agreed to testify against John that he had confessed to him that he had attacked Maria and killed Irene. But he had said more to Dale. He had confessed that she had come to the church rectory where he restrained her and fondled her breasts before moving her to the basement. He then moved her to another place where he put her in a bathtub with a bag over her head. She kept saying she couldn't breathe, but he left, and when he returned, she was dead. He then put her in the car and dropped her in the canal. Dale then said when he had heard this confession from John, he asked him, well, how are you here and not in prison? And he said there were actually 3 things that helped. He said, number 1, the church helped him, primarily a priest. Number 2, law enforcement helped him. And number 3, the seal of confession helped him as well. And then for the first time, one of Irene's childhood friends spoke out. This was Anna Hollingsworth, who testified that before her murder, Irene had actually come to her about John. And Irene had said, it's not the same going to confession anymore because I don't get to stay in the confessional. He comes to pull me out and says, oh, this place isn't good enough for you. Let's go to the rectory where you'll be more comfortable. For the first time, everyone was hearing that it wasn't Irene that went to the rectory for him. He had been scouting her. He had been forcing her to go with him, abusing his power all along. After a 6-day trial, John was found guilty, and the prosecution asked for him to be sentenced to 57 years, as long as it had taken to get Irene justice. Now, even better, he was actually sentenced to life. A family member of Irene said, I just feel like justice has been served. I'm sorry, I'm so tired. It has been such a long, long journey. Now, John remained in jail until February 12th of 2020 when he died of a heart attack. But he would have been eligible for parole at 92, which would have been in 2024. Do you believe the police and the church members covered up this murder until they no longer could? How many murders do you believe were and are covered up by higher-ups in the churches everywhere? Should those who kept John's secret for so long have been punished as well for making her family wait so long when they knew what had occurred? I mean, can you imagine the entire powerhouse of this community were able to slip this past and let a murderer free for 57 years while the good investigators and while the community knew what had happened and were sure of it? I mean, that is some crazy power that they had and abused to be able to do that. And that is quite scary to me. Also, remember you can get 60% off your yearly membership of Yours app with code Brooke or going to yoursapp.com/Brooke. Don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.